Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. This simply to stay well each day. Today's title is a bit provocative, if you will, and it requires a brief, light introduction. I will be reading documents that very carefully and thoughtfully approach the topic of knowledge about so called extraterrestrials or aliens, but specifically and particularly from an initiatory perspective. And just like last time, I am not talking about ufology from the, let's say, general point of view of everyone, and not for anyone in particular. It's not that I don't like it, but because so many people already talk about it, I speak from within my own area of expertise. And these are documents that I have acquired over time. And these documents were sent to those who at the time held certain degrees, both in Freemasonry and in the order I was part of. And they were sent to me to be kept safe. And there are many interesting things here. And for example, one thing that was mentioned in this document is a different perspective regarding the alien invasion, which is called the invisible invasion on an initiatory level. And this would explain a lot of what is happening now, especially considering that the decade from 2020 to 2030 is extremely rare. Just think that this alignment, that is the planetary positions and the galactic corridor that is currently open, lasts only 10 years and opens once every 258 million years. And the document even includes the positions and various other details. So that's why it's so important. That's why those who are aware of it are making such an effort. All right. I will read these documents. This is the first reading. It won't be very long, but it's the first reading to understand. So they were part of my documents, and they were also part of what was given to those of slightly lower ranks to read, right? For example, here there was a notice, the key of the worlds. It's not certain that I won't make a book out of it. I don't know. I have to wait and see what I'm told. The key of the worlds, a transcriptional document of the Villanova manuscripts. Yes, because these are my manuscripts received from different people. And I put together these booklets, and there are quite a few of them which were then, let's say, distributed. Presentation of materials received through unconventional channels and consolidated in this explanatory compendium. And this is what I read. So what I say is written here. What you are about to read represents the first authorized transcription of a series of initiatory documents received by Riccardo, Villanova, MRA, etc., over a period of 18 years, from 2002 to 2020, through communication methods that transcend the conventional parameters of information transmission. The original manuscripts, kept in an undisclosed location and accessible only to a select circle of initiates, contain annotations, diagrams, and notational systems whose origin presents significant anomalies that defy conventional categorizations. Part of the documentation was apparently produced in altered states of consciousness, while other sections display conceptual linguistic features that suggest the involvement of non-anthropocentric intelligences. So here this explanatory compendium addresses the nature and manifestation of the intelligences that coexist with humanity, entities that appear both in seemingly physical forms and through non-material interfaces, operating simultaneously in both the outer and inner dimensions of humanity, of human experience. The origin of this information cannot be verified through standard academic methodologies, nor can it be categorically dismissed. The documents contain references to historical events, astronomical configurations, and scientific advancements that preceded their documentation with a level of accuracy that is difficult to attribute to mere speculation or chance. Villanova himself has deliberately maintained a low profile regarding all this, systematically avoiding public exposure, a factor that has contributed to preserving the integrity of the material. So, this was to explain it to those who were receiving it, right? I have kept very quiet. I have spoken little about these things, but now they've told me, speak, speak. The few witnesses who have had direct access to the original manuscripts report unusual physical characteristics of the documentary material, its self-photoreactive properties that cannot be replicated with conventional technologies, and geometric patterns visible only under specific lighting conditions. This document does not claim to present absolute truth, nor does it seek to provoke criticism. So no one is telling you to believe it. I am just reading it to you, and then you can do as you wish. However, its publication responds to the imperative of informational availability required by the communication protocols described in the manuscripts themselves, according to which certain information must be made accessible during specific time windows that coincide with significant cosmic alignments, such as now. The reader, there who previously belonged to initiatory circles, invited to maintain a balance between analytical skepticism and receptive openness, the very cognitive posture that, according to Villanova, represents the only mental configuration capable of accurately perceiving the communication patterns documented here. Then some have been put, for example, something from Lovecraft. That is not dead, which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons, even death may die. Well, this then was handled by those who took care of the editing. And here we enter the introduction to the invisible invasion. There have been moments in history when the veil between worlds has grown so thin as to almost dissolve. The early years of the 20th century were one of these rare cosmic moments. And now, let's pay attention. At the dawn of the 20th century, while humanity celebrated technological and scientific progress, something unfathomable was making its way into the most sensitive minds of our world. It was not an invasion with spaceships or tentacled creatures marching through the streets of our cities, but a subtle and profound infiltration that manifested itself through the works of artists, writers, and occultists of the time. This book that was supposed to be published in 2000 but never came out, explores the unsettling hypothesis that men like Lovecraft, Arthur Machen, Aleister Crowley, and others of their time were not simply endowed with extraordinary imagination, but had become, whether consciously or not, channels of communication for alien intelligences seeking to establish contact with our dimension. How else can we explain the simultaneous obsession with the cosmic unknown that pervaded the works of these individuals? How can we account for the unsettling similarities between Lovecraft's visions, which he claimed were inspired by his dreams, and the rituals that Crowley asserted he had received from supernatural entities? Why did Arthur Machen, in his story The Great God Pan, describe experiences of contact with parallel dimensions so similar to those reported by mediums of the time who had never read his works? What truly inspired the strange landscapes of Alfred Kubin or the impossible architectures in the paintings of Tsusolar? What revealed to Gustav Meyrink the hidden truths behind the veil of reality that he included in his novel The Golem? In the following pages, you will explore the testimonies, connections, and unsettling parallels that suggest how, in the early years of the 20th century, something ancient and alien began to whisper into the minds of the most receptive human beings, initiating a cultural and spiritual transformation whose effects continue to reverberate in our own era. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about the birth of modern art, contemporary occultism, and fantastic literature. Because perhaps, as Lovecraft himself wrote, that is not dead, which can eternal lie. Good, I'm glad. Go ahead. So keep in mind then, I repeat this again, for those who haven't understood that this was then given to initiates of both Masonic circles and others. All right? So a book had to be made, it was made, and then it was stopped. So now those who have just joined are hearing the previous things. In-depth analysis, the invisible invasion, the introduction to the invisible invasion here, there was an entry. Basically, after the introduction, an in-depth analysis was made of the introduction itself to the invisible invasion so that it could be explained. I did this too. This one was also done by me. The introduction of the invisible invasion establishes a fascinating premise that deserves a more in-depth analysis. Let's examine the key elements that make this thesis so intriguing. The veil between worlds, first. The opening immediately establishes a cosmology in which worlds exist, separated from ours by a metaphysical veil that occasionally grows thin. This concept echoes various esoteric traditions. The Celtic notion of the thin veil that separates the material world from the spiritual one. The theosophical concept of planes of existence developed by Helena Blavatsky during that very period at the beginning of the 20th century. The agnostic idea that higher dimensions exist, normally inaccessible to human perception. What makes this premise particularly effective is its anchoring to a specific historical period, identifying the early years of the 20th century as one of these rare cosmic moments. The introduction suggests the existence of cosmic cycles that determine the permeability between dimensions, an idea present in many ancient mythologies, and, interestingly, revisited by modern theoretical physics with the concepts of the multiverse and cosmic membranes. Okay? So this is, I wrote it to explain to the students at the time, right? This text, this introduction, I was told by those above me at the time, try to explain this introduction better and focus on the key points, okay? The subtle invasion. The introduction skillfully subverts the reader's expectations regarding the concept of alien invasion. Instead of the Hollywood narrative of flying saucers and tentacled creatures, which, believe me, is just a cover up, it's not true. It proposes something much more unsettling, an infiltration that takes place directly in the human mind. This idea touches on much deeper archetypal fears: the loss of mental autonomy, invisible manipulation, the idea that our most creative thoughts might actually come from somewhere else. The invasion described operates through the subconscious and manifests as artistic inspiration, a mechanism much more sophisticated and difficult to detect than a physical invasion. Synchronicity as evidence. One of the most compelling elements in the introduction is the way Villanova uses synchronicity as circumstantial evidence. The simultaneous emergence of similar themes among artists, writers, and occultists who were working independently is presented as a clue that something external was influencing these creative minds. This observation has a real historical basis. The first 2 decades of the 20th century did indeed witness a simultaneous explosion of new artistic, literary, and spiritual movements that displayed striking conceptual parallels. The emergence of abstract art Kandinsky Mondrian, the birth of weird and cosmic literature Lovecraft, Machen, the development of tonal atonal music Schoenberg, Webern, the spread of new occult movements, Crowley's Thelema and Steiner's Anthroposophy. The introduction uses this historical convergence to suggest a common origin, an external source that was transmitting similar ideas to different recipients. The human channels. The selection of human channels mentioned in the introduction is strategic and well calibrated. Lovecraft, a self-declared rationalist who nevertheless produced a surprisingly coherent cosmic mythology, feeling that his stories were, coming to him in dreams. Arthur Machen, a member of esoteric societies who explore the theme of the incursion of the supernatural into the ordinary world, Aleister Crowley, an occultist who explicitly claimed to communicate with non-human entities, in particular with the entity called I Was, who supposedly dictated to him the Book of the Law. Alfred Kubin, a visionary artist whose unsettling landscapes seem to belong to another dimension. Sul Solar, creator of impossible architectures and cosmic languages intended for interstellar communication. Gustav Meyrink, author of the esoteric novel The Golem, set in a Prague where ordinary reality conceals mystical dimensions. This selection covers a spectrum ranging from the skeptical rationalist Lovecraft to the declared occultist Crowley, suggesting that alien influence could manifest regardless of the recipient's personal beliefs. Implications of the thesis. The implications of this premise are vast and unsettling. The rewriting of fun, the rewriting of cultural history. If the hypothesis were true, much of modernist art, fantastic literature, and contemporary occultism would not be human creations, but translations of alien influences. This is what we ask in media circles. 2. Rethinking creativity. The very idea of artistic inspiration is reconsidered as a possible channel of interdimensional communication, transforming the artist from creator to medium. 3. Continuity of influence. The final statement suggests that this influence has not ended, but continues to reverberate in our era, implying that the invasion might still be ongoing. Overturning of cultural evolution. 4. The introduction suggests that the revolutionary artistic movements of the early 20th century did not represent a natural evolution of human culture, but rather a disruption caused by an external intelligence. Strategies of this narrative. The introduction employs several strategies. 1. Unanswered questions. It poses questions that instill doubt and curiosity, thus inviting the reader to continue in order to find answers. Self-referentiality. It quotes Lovecraft himself. There is no dead which can eternal lie, creating a meta-narrative loop that reinforces the central thesis to stimulate the student. Investigative tone. It adopts the language of scientific inquiry, presenting the hypothesis as the result of rational analysis rather than as a fantastical speculation. Epistemological challenge. It explicitly invites the reader to question everything they thought they knew. Right? Linguistics and all that stuff here. Aesthetics. Positioning the text as a revealer of hidden truths. Contemporary resonances. I repeat, for those just joining now, these were notes given to the initiatory circles to whom these were sent, in order to explain things to them. The premise of the introduction particularly resonates with contemporary sensibilities. It recalls theories such as Erich von Daniken's ancient astronaut hypothesis or Jacques Vallée's ideas about the ultra-terrestrial origin of the UFO phenomenon. It echoes concepts from quantum physics such as entanglement and non-locality and aligns with the growing popularity of psychedelic experiences as a means to access non-ordinary information. Furthermore, in the era of artificial neural networks and artificial intelligence, the idea that human creativity can be influenced and guided by other intelligences takes on new introspective dimensions. Keep in mind, this was written between 2002 and 2020. Because artificial intelligence already existed in 1997. No, it didn't just come out now. It's coming out now for a reason that over time we will come to understand. If I end up writing a book about it, then it will be done. Analytical conclusion. The Invisible Invasion proposes a cosmology in which human cultural history is more porous and vulnerable than is commonly believed. The introduction strikes a delicate balance between imaginative speculation and pseudo-rational argumentation, creating a narrative that is paradoxically all the more unsettling the more it draws on real historical events and documentable synchronicities. Its appeal lies in its ability to turn what art history regards as the moments of greatest human originality into potential evidence of alien influence. This interpretative reversal invites the reader to reconsider not only the art and literature of the early 20th century, but also the very concept of originality and the porous nature of the boundary between inspiration and external influence. I wanted to say something that, besides that, I was basically assigned to this, and for, what is it? So, to carry out this investigation from the orders where I was, and I did it both on a cultural and artistic level. I also did another one on a scientific level, revealing all the key moments, the coincidences, all these interferences and leaps in knowledge, even scientific knowledge. And this is something we can talk about later. There are all the documents I produced over 18 years, of study, research, and various things, to hand them over back when I was in the Lodge of Perfection and I was teaching these things, and then to eventually get there. So, the story of the alien invasion in the minds of the early 20th century can only begin with two figures whose intelligence and influence extend to our own day. Howard Phillips Lovecraft and Arthur Machen, two men very different in origin and temperament, yet united by the same unsettling vision, that of an ancient and indifferent universe inhabited by entities incomprehensible to the human mind. So, wait a second. Wait, who is it? Nothing. I was just nothing. Shadows over Providence. In 1921, in a modest home in Providence, Rhode Island, a solitary New England gentleman began to write stories that would forever alter our perception of the cosmos. Lovecraft was not an occultist, nor did he have any particular interest in esotericism. He described himself as an atheist materialist, a rationalist devoted to science. I can't answer. I'm reading, I'm not looking at them. Yet, the stories that emerge from his mind during sleep, because Lovecraft insisted that his most powerful tales were born from his dream, spoke of ancient alien gods, parallel dimensions, and forbidden knowledge. It is significant that just as the first radio telescopes began to scan the night sky, Lovecraft described a cosmology in which Earth had been visited by beings from the stars in prehistoric times. His great Old Ones creatures like Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Azathoth were not gods in the traditional sense, but extraterrestrial entities of immeasurable power that existed beyond our space and time. A man who had never studied theoretical physics was anticipating concepts of multiple dimensions and relativity, describing them through narrative fiction. A man who had never studied anthropology was developing interconnected global mythologies that seemed to echo buried truths found in all human cultures. We have to ask ourselves, what if these stories were not mere invention? What does it say here? 1902, they were introducing anyway, okay? So then we'll talk about Harry Potter. But if I read, I can't read. If I read you, I can't read here. You choose, let's do it another time, let's do it. The Welsh precursor. Even before Lovecraft began to write, a Welsh author had already blazed similar trails into the realm of the unknown. These are private documents, my documents, documents I made for the orders, so it's an important matter. Listen to them for a moment, then we can talk. So even before Lovecraft began to write, a Welsh author had already blazed similar trails into the realm of the unknown. Arthur Machen, born in Monmouthshire in 1863, he published The Great God Pan in 1894, scandalizing Victorian readers with his story of experiments that tore the veil between dimensions, allowing a primordial entity to infiltrate our world. Unlike Lovecraft, Machen was deeply immersed in esoteric traditions, being a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, alongside figures such as William Butler Yeats and Aleister Crowley. His stories spoke of a little people who lived underground, of a primordial world that existed parallel to our own, of a hidden reality that sometimes manifested itself in isolated places or during altered states of consciousness. It is remarkable how Machen and Lovecraft, without ever having met and with very little correspondence, developed such similar mythologies. Both describe the clueless humanity living on an island of apparent normality in a cosmic ocean of strangeness and horror. Both suggested that reality was just a thin veil that could sometimes be torn, revealing truths that the human mind was not equipped to comprehend. The astral books, the Necronomicon and its brethren, perhaps no element better embodies the nature of alien invasion in the creative minds of the early 20th century when it comes to the phenomenon than that of the astral books. Imaginary texts that in some way seem to possess an existence that transcended fiction. The most famous of these is without a doubt the Necronomicon, the imaginary grimoire created by Lovecraft and first mentioned in his story The Hound in 1922. This text, supposedly written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred in the 8th century, contained cosmic secrets and formulas for contacting beings from other dimensions. What makes the Necronomicon such a fascinating case study is how, starting from its purely fictional creation, it began to acquire a sort of pseudo-existence in the real world. Libraries started receiving requests to consult it. Booksellers were asked about its availability. Occultists claim to have seen copies of it in private collections. It's as if the idea of the book began to materialize in the collective reality, blurring the boundaries between invention and truth. Machen had preceded Lovecraft in this as well, creating in his story The Black Seal, 1895, references to the Black Book of Soldi, another imaginary grimoire that was said to contain forbidden knowledge. Other authors of the time, almost as if responding to a common impulse, created their own imaginary texts. Robert Chambers with The King in Yellow, a play whose reading led to madness. William Hope Hodgson with the Samite rites mentioned in Karnaki's tales. These astral books, as we will call them in the following chapters, seem to function as a sort of alien memory imprinted in the creative minds of the era. Their most unsettling characteristic is the internal coherence they developed over time, as if the authors were all unconsciously drawing from a common source of information. Let me pause for a moment. Later, there will also be readings related to science, Tesla, and all these things. So we will do that here as well. You will get the answers. Right now, we are talking about art. It is particularly significant that many of these writers insisted that their creations came to them fully formed, often through dreams or altered states of consciousness. Lovecraft, in particular, described the creative process as an almost passive experience in which he merely transcribed visions that appeared to him during sleep. In his letters, he often expressed surprise at the details and connections that emerged in his stories, as if he were not the true author. And he wasn't. We must consider the unsettling possibility that these imaginary books were actually echoes of alien knowledge, transmitted through channels not yet understood by human consciousness and human science. Astral books might represent the clearest example of how non-human intelligences have used literary imagination as a vehicle to infiltrate our cultural realities. In the next chapter, we will explore how this mental invasion manifested itself in the visual arts and music of the period, creating a completely new aesthetic language that broke with centuries of tradition. But before we conclude, we must ask ourselves, if Lovecraft and Machen were among the first to be contacted, how many others after them have unknowingly served as channels for these alien communications? And more importantly, what was the ultimate purpose of this attempt at communication? The answer might be found in the pages of books that, although they do not physically exist, have left an indelible mark on our collective psyche. So here is the beginning of when this extraterrestrial current started to arrive and enter the minds of artists and everyone else. As I mentioned, for those who have just tuned in, this is a document I wrote over 18 years, basically a collection of things, and I also did it for science, which we'll get to, and to give what I gave directly. Yes, also to give directly to those who at the time were joining the various lodges. Then, chapter 2, Visions from Beyond. The artist is a receptacle of emotions that come from everywhere, from the sky, from the earth, from a piece of paper, from a passing figure, from a spider's web. There are forms that sleep. One must know how to awaken them. Pablo Picasso. If literatura, I actually read this in Vienna, by the way. If literature provided the first evidence of alien invasion in creative minds, it was in the visual art of the early 20th century that this influence reached its most explicit manifestation. It's astonishing. A wave of new artistic movements emerged almost simultaneously in different parts of Europe, as if an invisible force were orchestrating a global aesthetic revolution. The dissolution of form. The 19th century had ended with figurative art still firmly anchored to the representation of the visible. Then, almost suddenly, artists all over Europe began to fragment, distort, and ultimately abandon recognizable forms altogether. Picasso and Braque's Cubism, Kandinsky's abstract expressionism, Italian futurism, Russian suprematism, all these movements, despite their differences, shared a common drive: the need to transcend material reality in order to capture something that existed beyond human perception. Vasily Kandinsky, in particular, stands as a prime example. In his treatise concerning the spiritual in art, 1910, the Russian artist described how forms and colors could evoke spiritual vibrations and how abstract art was an attempt to represent things and realities that are not physical. What makes Kandinsky's case so significant is that he attributed his conversion to abstraction to an almost mystical experience. Returning to his studio at dusk, he did not initially recognize one of his own paintings resting on its side, instead perceiving it as a composition of pure forms and colors that radiated extraordinary power. This is accurate because in instructions at a certain high level, students are often taught not to perceive the concept of what they see, that is, not to perceive through the mind, but to perceive directly what they are experiencing. So Kandinsky, being an artist but also driven by these things, came directly into contact with this. Isn't this perhaps a perfect metaphor for encountering the alien as well? The vision of something familiar from a completely new perspective that reveals previously inaccessible dimensions. Surrealist automatisms. If Cubism and abstract art represented the first attempts to overcome the limits of ordinary perception, it was with Surrealism that the alien influence found its most direct expression. Officially founded in 1924 with André Breton's manifesto, Surrealism adopted techniques such as automatic writing and automatic drawing, methods explicitly designed to bypass conscious control and allow external alien content to manifest. It is revealing how artists such as Max Ernst, André Masson, and John Miro insisted that their most significant works were created in states of trance during which they felt they were merely instruments of forces that transcended them. Ernst, in particular, developed techniques such as frottage and decalcomania that introduced elements of chance into the creative process, allowing forms to emerge that he himself had not consciously conceived. Salvador Dali, with his paranoia critical method, claimed he could access parallel realities by inducing controlled hallucinatory states. His famous melting clocks in the persistence of memory, 1931, seem to allude to a dimension in which the physical laws of our universe, including the linear flow of time, cease to operate. But perhaps the most unsettling example is that of Rome Remedios Varo, whose art is populated by hybrid beings, impossible architectures, and enigmatic machines that seem to operate according to unknown physical principles. Varro, deeply interested in occultism and theosophy, believed that artists could serve as mediums for higher intelligences. In her paintings, humanoid figures often manipulate instruments that seem designed to communicate with other planes of existence. The isolated visionaries. Outside of official movements, numerous solitary artists produced works that seem to document direct contact with non human intelligences. Alfred Cubin, with his spectral landscapes and primordial creatures, anticipated many of the Lovecraftian visions. His illustrations for The Other Side, 1909, a novel he himself wrote, depict a city located in an alternate dimension whose inhabitants gradually degenerate into semi bestial forms under the influence of mysterious forces. Austin Osman Spare, a British occult artist, developed a magical system based on sigils and glyphs, which, according to him, allowed communication with entities from other planes. His drawings, created in trance states, feature metamorphic faces and biomorphic forms that emerge from one another in a continuous flow, defying logic. Solar, an Argentine artist, created paintings populated by impossible architectures and angelic beings, accompanied by inscriptions in invented languages that he called Neocriolo and Panlengua. Solar claimed that these languages had been revealed to him by spiritual entities as tools for cosmic communication, a bit like Enochian and angelic languages that can be found here and there. Hilma af Klint, perhaps the most extraordinary case, produced hundreds of abstract paintings starting in 1906 years before Kandinsky and Mondrian, which she kept hidden with the request that they not be shown until 20 years after her death. Af Klint explicitly claimed that these works had been commissioned to her by spiritual entities, which she called the High Ones, and that they represented cosmic truths that humanity was not yet ready to receive. It is significant how many of these artists felt the need to create complex cosmological systems to contextualize their visions. These systems often display striking structural similarities, even though they were developed independently and in different places. Hierarchies of non-human intelligences, parallel dimensions that intersect with our own, subtle energies that permeate the universe. Let me repeat, all of this is a document written by me, a book that I gave to, I'm saying this for those who have just joined to the initiates of that time. The Chirico was influencious, even the Chirico, Chapter 3, Melodies from the Stars. Music is the language of our kind, of others from planets and stars. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. If visual art offered images of alternative realities, the music of the early decades of the 20th century seemed intent on capturing the very sound of the alien, breaking with centuries of Western harmonic tradition to explore entirely new sonic territories. The dissolution of tonal harmony. The process of moving away from the traditional tonal system, which had already begun in the late Romantic period, reached its peak in the early years of the 20th century with the emergence of atonality and 12-tone technique. Arnold Schoenberg, in his 1911 Harmony Manual, described the need to free sounds from the chains of tonality as an almost spiritual imperative, a necessary step in the evolution of human musical consciousness. It is significant that Schoenberg, like many of his contemporaries, was deeply interested in theosophy and occultism. His unfinished work, Jacob's Ladder, was based on the idea of communication between the earthly world and higher dimensions. The composer himself described the creative act as a process of reception rather than invention, a terminology that eerily recalls that of spiritual mediums. His student, Alan Berg, took this idea even further, incorporating into his music complex numerological systems and hidden structures that seem to reflect invisible cosmic orders. His 1925 opera Wozzeck features one of the earliest portrayals of an alienated psyche experience, with the protagonist perceiving alternative realities inaccessible to the other characters. Noises from the future. Parallel to the development of atonality in the classical tradition, Italian futurism proposed an even more radical revolution, the incorporation of noise into the musical language. Luigi Russolo, in his 1913 manifesto The Art of Noises, proclaimed the need to expand the sonic universe to include the din of streets, engines, and everything that represents modern life. What makes this movement particularly relevant to our analysis is the explicit connection between noise and the idea of communication with non human realities. Russolo built specific instruments called intonarumori, which produced sounds never heard before, describing them as voices of a new sonic universe. The composer and theorist Francesco Balilla Pratella spoke of the need to capture cosmic vibrations through new musical forms. You see, during that period, all of this was happening, so the alien invasion is the invisible one. It's hard not to see in this experiment an attempt to tune into alien frequencies to create a sonic language capable of establishing a bridge between different dimensions. Scriabin and cosmic synesthesia. Alexander Scriabin represents Scriabin. In short, he is perhaps the most explicit example of a composer who conceived of music as a vehicle for extraterrestrial communication. Deeply influenced by the theosophical doctrines of Helena Blavatsky, Scriabin developed a musical system based on the so-called mystic chord, a combination of sounds that, according to him, could open portals to other dimensions. I think none of you knew these things, or maybe some of you did, but I believe this is something new for you to learn. Something that goes beyond just, I see the flying saucer. His ambitious unfinished project, which, by the way, you can still see the flying saucer, but always induced in this way, his ambitious unfinished project, Mysterium, was meant to be a multisensory ritual work to be performed in the Himalayas for 7 days and 7 nights, with the stated goal of transforming humanity and ushering in a new cosmic era. Scriabin believed that the proper combination of sounds, colors, scents, and movements, along with ritual and ceremonial magic, could literally dissolve material reality, allowing humanity to merge with higher intelligences. It is significant that Scriabin was a synesthete. He would spontaneously perceive specific colors when he heard certain musical tones. This neurological condition, particularly common among composers of the period, could be interpreted as a form of heightened perceptual capacity to grasp aspects of reality that are normally inaccessible, isolated sonic messengers. Just as in visual art, in music too, we find solitary figures who seem to have received especially powerful signals from beyond. Eric Satie, with his enigmatic and minimalist compositions, completely broke away from the traditions of his time, creating repetitive and hypnotic sound structures that anticipated minimalist music by decades. These gymnopédies and gnossiennes seem suspended outside of time, as if floating in a dreamlike state, untouched by the ordinary flow of hours and minutes, like mysterious messages sent from a parallel dimension, reaching out to listeners across the boundaries of reality. In America, Charles Ives composed sound layers of incredible complexity, superimposing different melodies and rhythms in polytonal constructions that, in his words, represented the echo of the universe resonating in human ears. His Universe Symphony, designed to be performed by orchestras positioned on different hills, anticipated concepts of sound spatialization that would only be revisited in electronic music after World War II. Percy Grainger, an Australian composer, was ahead of his time in electronic music by building experimental instruments such as the Free Music Machine, designed to produce continuous, non-tempered sounds which, in his view, represented the music of the spheres, the natural sound of the cosmos, unfiltered by the limitations of human perception. A ritual as an antenna. A recurring element in the music of this period is the importance given to the ritual dimension of performance. Igor Stravinsky, with his revolutionary The Rite of Spring in 1913, recreated an imaginary pagan sacrificial ritual, unleashing primitive rhythms and dissonances that caused a real scandal at its premiere. Stravinsky himself described the composition as something that came through him rather than from him. This is what we are talking about. This emphasis on musical ritual as a means to establish connections with primordial forces appears in many composers of the era and recalls shamanic practices found in different cultures where sound is used as a vehicle for interdimensional journeys. It is significant that many of the musical innovations of this periomicrotonality, complex polyrhythms, extended instrumental techniques had parallels in ancient non-Western musical traditions. It is as if European composers, in their attempt to break away from their own past, were rediscovering sonic modalities that had always been used in cultures with a more permeable view between the material world and spiritual dimensions. In the coming chapters, as suggested, we will explore the psychological impact of this mental invasion, analyzing how these new visions and sounds have altered everyone's collective perception and sense of reality. We will then examine the startling correlation between the intensification of these alien contacts and the outbreak of the two world wars that reshaped the geopolitical and psychic map of humanity, something that is now being attempted, again, as we will see in the appendices for those who wish to continue listening. But not now, okay, but earlier, because there are 100 and somehow many are there. So 120 pages then. But before proceeding, we must ask ourselves, if this alien influence was so pervasive in the visual and musical arts, what traces has it left in the deep psyche of humanity? And an even more unsettling question, were these beings merely observers of a humanity undergoing rapid technological evolution? Or did they have a specific agenda in steering this evolution in certain directions? By the way, I should let you know that I will also read the initiatory explanation, as I gave it to the orders when I was a member, of Gurdjieff's most enigmatic book, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. So everyone tells me they've read it, but I'll provide this document that was once only for initiates. I'll read it to you with the initiatory explanation itself. Yes, this thing here. There will also be Mickey Mouse, everyone. Chapter 5. War as a Cosmic Laboratory. Wars are never accidental. Wars are the quintessence of human intentionality, or perhaps we should say of the intentionality that operates through humans. René Guénon, 1927. The orchestrated conflict. If the artists, writers, and composers of the early 20th century acted as receiving antennas for alien influences, the events that followed suggest that these entities were not satisfied with mere cultural infiltration. The escalation that led to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 represented a disturbing shift from subtle influence to the direct manipulation of historical events on a global scale. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, the event that triggered the conflict, displays characteristics of synchronicity that defy conventional explanations. The Archduke's car, after avoiding a first assassination attempt, took an unplanned detour that brought it directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, one of the attackers who had already given up on the mission and happened to be at that spot by chance. The chain of coincidences required for this fatal encounter was calculated by the mathematical historian Pierre Verimont to be statistically impossible without the intervention of some external coordinating factor. But beyond the triggering event, it is the very nature of the conflict itself that suggests a non-human influence. The First World War represented such a radical break from all previous wars that it almost seemed like a deliberate experiment. Just as was the case with the recent pandemic, we will talk about this and see why. Why? I'll say, why was there a pandemic? It almost seems like a deliberate experiment to test the limits of the human psyche under extreme conditions. The anomaly of the First World War, the Great War, stands out in human history for several factors that make it an anomaly. Its strategic absurdity. None of the declared objectives of the belligerents rationally justified the level of destruction and human sacrifice. As the British diplomat Harold Nicolson observed, it was a war in which no one really knew why they were fighting or what they hoped to achieve by winning. 2. Its tactical irrationality. For 4 years, millions of men kept launching frontal assaults against fortified positions and machine guns, repeating the same failed tactic with a stubbornness that defies all military logic. They got themselves killed. The German general Erich von Falkenhayn described this phenomenon as a collective madness that seemed to take hold of commanders on both sides. Amidst its ritualistic aesthetics, the battles of the First World War, especially those on the Western Front, often took on almost ritualistic characteristics. Assaults carried out at dawn following precise geometric patterns, with a choreography that seemed to respond more to ceremonial needs than to military ones. And we know that aliens love ceremonies. 4. Its disproportionate psychic impact, the mental trauma caused by the war, far exceeded that of previous conflicts, such as what we now call PTSD, which manifested with symptoms incomprehensible to the nosology of the time. Selective mutism, paralysis without physical causes, specific amnesia for traumatic events. 5. Its anomalous temporality. The war ended almost theatrically at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, a numerological symmetry that can hardly be considered a coincidence. Taken together, these factors suggest that the First World War was not so much a geopolitical conflict as a gigantic psychic experiment, like the pandemic, a mass ritual designed to reconfigure, like a pandemic, the collective consciousness of Western humanity. The traumatic spectacle. The philosopher Paul Virilio described the Great War as the first global media spectacle, an event designed not only to be fought, but to be observed for the first time in history. A war was systematically documented through photography, cinema, radio, and the mass press, creating a traumatic, shared experience that transcended national borders. It is significant and meaningful that many of the new media documenting the war had been invented or perfected precisely in the period immediately preceding the conflict, as if they had been deliberately developed for this purpose. The synchronization between the emergence of mass communication technologies and the outbreak of a conflict ideal for testing their potential is, at the very least, suspicious. The images of the trenches, the devastated battlefields, and the mutilated soldiers created what the collective psychologist Carl Stump defined as a shared trauma that permanently altered the nervous system of the West. For the first time, humanity experienced a traumatic event as a single organism, an ideal condition for large-scale psychic imprinting. I'm almost done, because I think keeping them for an hour is already too much. Mass experiments on the battlefield. If we consider the First World War as a laboratory, we can identify several specific experiments that seem to have been conducted. 1. The gas experiment. The introduction of chemical weapons represented a qualitative leap in horror and the horrors of war. Unlike conventional weapons, chemical warfare gases acted on an invisible level, altering the very biochemistry of the soldiers. Survivors suffered not only physical damage, but also profound changes in sensory perception and cognition. The survivors' conditions. The chemist Fritz Haber, father of chlorine gas as a weapon, reported in a private letter from 1918 that soldiers exposed to super-lethal concentrations displayed heightened sensitivity to phenomena normally beyond the perceptual threshold. A cryptic allusion to enhanced psychic abilities. Just think, I used to send all this information to the Masonic lodges. I sent it, now it's yours, and I sent it to the orders. Now I know, and I will keep reading. 2. The sound experiment. The new heavy artillery produced sound waves of an intensity never before experienced by humans. When the chapter ends, I'll stop. Military doctors documented a condition called selective deafness, in which soldiers lost the ability to hear certain frequency ranges while becoming hypersensitive to others, normally imperceptible to the human ear. Military psychologist Charles Myers described cases of soldiers who claimed to hear voices coming from the ground or messages carried by the wind auditory hallucinations or perceptions of alien communications. By producing the noise, you can easily perceive it along with the sound of drums, or the noise itself becomes perceptible. Those who experiment with EVP, electronic voice phenomena, do it as well. Among them is the experiment of sensory deprivation. Life in the trenches subjected soldiers to conditions of sensory isolation alternated with traumatic overstimulation. A protocol that eerily resembles modern mind reprogramming techniques. The soldiers' diaries are full of accounts of dissociative experiences, collective visions, and altered states of consciousness that occurred during the long periods of immobility in the muddy trenches, followed by bursts of extreme violence. 4. The experiment of social restructuring. The war destroyed in just a few years social structures, hierarchies, and value systems that had remained stable for centuries. Social classes that had never mixed before found themselves side by side in the trenches. Women entered en masse into roles that had previously been reserved for men. Centuries old monarchies collapsed in a matter of months. This restructuring created a collective psychological void, an ideal condition for the implantation of new alien models of thought and behavior. The conscious witnesses. If this interpretation of the war as an alien experiment seems like science fiction, it is important to note that several contemporary observers independently reached similar conclusions. The poet Guy Bejuel Apollinaire speaks with a slightly slurred tongue. Guillaume Apollinaire, who served in the French army, wrote in his 1916 diary that this war is not human. It is as if something is using humanity for an incomprehensible purpose. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung was even more explicit. In a 1917 letter, he described the war as a psychic infection of non-human alien origin and suggested that intelligences not belonging to this plane of existence are conducting an experiment with the collective consciousness of the West that is still ongoing. And what about us? Rudolf Steiner, founder of anthroposophy, gave a series of lectures in 1916 in which he spoke explicitly about spiritual entities that were using the war to draw the course of human spiritual evolution toward Ahrimanic forces. Even military figures, such as the British General Sir John French, reported in a classified memorandum from 1915 episodes of unidentified lights over the battlefields and cases of inexplicable mental influence that simultaneously affected soldiers on opposing fronts. The interlude and the preparation. The end of the First World War did not mark the conclusion of the experiment, but rather a pause for data analysis and preparation for the next phase. The years between the two world wars, far from being a period of peace, represented a social laboratory in which the psychological changes produced by the Great War were consolidated and amplified. The simultaneous emergence of totalitarian systems in different nations, fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, and Stalinism in the Soviet Union, suggests a coordinated pattern rather than a coincidence. These regimes, beyond their ideological differences, shared structural characteristics that made them ideal instruments for the mass manipulation of the psyche. First, a cult of personality around the leader, which served as a focal point for collective psychic energy. Second, the systematic use of public rituals, symbols, and uniforms to create states of collective trance. Third, the permanent mobilization of society through a continuous state of emergency. Does that sound familiar to you? Fourth, the pioneering use of new technologies and communication methods for the psychic programming of the masses. Fifth, an obsession with the occult and the ancient origins of their own civilization. It is significant that many of the leaders and ideologues of these movements reported experiences of contact with non-human intelligences. Hitler spoke of voices that guided him during moments of trance. Mussolini held the spiritualist seances at Villa Torlonia. Numerous high-ranking Nazi officials were members of the Thule Society, which claimed to communicate with entities from Aldebaran. The second experiment, total war. If the First World War was a preliminary test, the second represented the full experiment. This time, the entire planet became the laboratory, with every aspect of human society involved in the conflict. The scale of the experimentation was exponentially amplified. 1. The biochemical experiment from gas chambers to the first antibiotics, from amphetamines given to pilots to experiments in controlled undernourishment. The Second World War transformed the human body into a biochemical laboratory on an industrial scale. Particularly significant were the Japanese experiments of Unit 731 and the Nazi experiments in concentration camps, which seemed aimed not so much at military purposes as at testing the physical and psychological limits of the human body. 2. The atomic experiment. Nuclear energy, the power of the stars brought down to Earth, represents such a radical discontinuity in human history that it suggests a non terrestrial origin. It is significant that many of the physicists involved in the Manhattan Project reported recurring dreams and visions that preceded their scientific insights. Robert Oppenheimer, quoting the Bhagavad Gita after the Trinity test, said, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," and seemed aware that he had been the channel for knowledge that transcended the human. In initiatory circles, it is also said that Majorana was an alien, an extraterrestrial. He was such a genius in these matters that he even shocked Enrico Fermi. 3. The genetic experiment usually appears and disappears, or takes on a body, enters the mind, not that he was one physically. 3. The genetic experiment, the eugenic policies of the Third Reich, as well as the forced sterilization experiments conducted in various Western countries, suggest an interest in manipulating the human gene pool that went beyond the stated ideological motivations. Dr. Joseph Mengele, in his private notes recovered in Brazil in the 1970s, explicitly spoke about preparing the human genome for future changes and programmed hybridization. Also, all those people who go around, so to speak, a terminology that eerily anticipates modern genetic engineering. 4. The experiment of mass death, the Holocaust, and other genocides of the period represent an extreme form of collective trauma, a tearing of the human psyche that seems designed to produce a specific evolutionary response. The Jewish American psychologist Rachel Lewis, studying the survivors of the camps and their descendants, has documented epigenetic changes and unusual psychic abilities that persist across generations, as if the extreme traumatic experience had activated latent potentials in human DNA. The technological quantum leap, perhaps the most revealing aspect of World War II as an alien experiment, was the sudden technological acceleration that, in 6 years, took humanity from fabric-covered fuselage airplanes to supersonic jets. 6 years. From manual calculations to the first electronic computers, from wired communications to radar technology, from bolt-action rifles to atomic weapons. This technological evolutionary discontinuity has no parallel in human history and challenges conventional explanations based solely on the pressures of war. The simultaneous emergence of revolutionary technologies in different fields suggests a coordinated download of advanced knowledge into the human mind. It is significant that many of these innovations were attributed to moments of sudden insight or altered states of consciousness. For example, Vannevar Bush, the coordinator of American scientific research during the war, noted in a declassified 1944 memorandum that a statistically anomalous number of critical breakthroughs occurred during trance-like sleep states or high fever. And there is also the concept of fire in alchemy, and he wondered whether some external influence was accelerating our progress in specific directions. The post-war program. The conclusion of the Second World War did not mark the end of the experiment, but rather the transition to a new phase. The Cold War, with its constant threat of nuclear annihilation, kept humanity in a state of chronic stress that was ideal for ongoing psychic manipulation. It is during this period that we see the emergence of official research programs on human psychic abilities, mind control, and contact with non-human intelligences. Projects like MKUltra in the United States and the Setka program in the Soviet Union seem to follow directives that went beyond mere geopolitical competition. A particularly significant aspect of this competition was both superpowers' obsession with space. The space race, publicly presented as a technological competition, actually had ritual and symbolic components that suggest deeper motivations. Both American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts reported experiences of contact with presences during orbital missions accounts that were systematically censored by their respective governments, but documented in recently declassified archives. The psychic legacy. What was the final outcome of this gigantic experiment carried out through two world wars? The evidence suggests a profound recalibration of the human psyche, a preparation for more direct contact with alien intelligences. The generations born after 1945 display psychological characteristics that are significantly different from those of previous generations. 1. Greater openness to the concept of extraterrestrial life and multiple realities. 2. Increased incidence of anomalous perceptual experiences such as out-of-body experiences and memories of past lives. 3. Enhanced ability to process visual and complex information simultaneously. 4. Decreased attachment to traditional cultural and religious identities. 5. Growing interest in altered states of consciousness and technologies for inner transformation. These changes suggest a deliberate tuning of human consciousness to make it more compatible with non-terrestrial modes of perception and cognition. The humanity that emerged from the ashes of the Second World War was neurologically and psychologically different from the one that had entered it, as if the entire planet had undergone a process of collective initiation. Conclusion: the Great Awakening. Today, decades later, we can begin to see the full picture. The alien invasion of the human psyche, which began as a subtle infiltration into the minds of artists and visionaries in the early 1900s, used the world wars as catalysts for an accelerated transformation of collective consciousness. The ultimate goal of this intervention remains open to interpretation. Some evidence suggests a benevolent program of guided evolution, an attempt to help humanity overcome evolutionary limitations before its technology led it to self-destruction. Others point to a more ambiguous project of biological and psychic preparation for a future hybridization. Maybe these are the experiments they're conducting with all the migrations, or maybe not. They need to see how it works. What does seem certain is that today's humanity is the product not only of its own natural evolution, but also of a deliberate intervention in its psychic and cultural trajectory. The wars that mark the 20th century, beyond the terrible human suffering, can be understood as collective rites of passage painful, like the pandemic itself, but necessary moments of death and rebirth in the process of transforming earthly consciousness. In the next chapter, which we will read later, not now, I'm done, we will explore how this alien infiltration continued to operate in the post-war period, manifesting itself through the UFO phenomenon. The countercultural movements of the 1960s and 70s and the emergence of new consciousness technologies may represent the culmination of this long cosmic experiment. For those who joined later, I'll read the introduction to this, just a few lines to help you understand what they are, what you're understanding. It was a set of documents given to initiates and various others. A notice, the Key of Worlds, a transcription document from the Villanova manuscripts. This was written by the person who then distributed them. Presentation of materials received through unconventional channels and consolidated in this explanatory compendium. What you are about to read is the first authorized transcription of a series of initiatory documents received by Riccardo Villanova MRA over a period of 18 years, from 2002 to 2020, through communication methods that transcend the conventional parameters of information transmission. The original manuscripts, kept in an undisclosed location, accessible only to a select circle of initiates, contain annotations, diagrams, and notational systems whose origins display significant anomalies that defy conventional categorization. Part of the document, so this is an excerpt from those documents, part of the documentation was apparently produced in altered states of consciousness, while other sections display linguistic and conceptual features that suggest the involvement of non-anthropocentric intelligences. This explanatory compendium addresses the nature and manifestation of the intelligences that coexist with humanity entities that appear both in seemingly physical forms and through non-material interfaces, operating simultaneously in the outer and inner dimensions of human experience. The origin of this information cannot be verified through standard academic methodologies, nor can it be categorically dismissed. The documents contain references to historical events, astronomical configurations, as we will see, and scientific advancements that preceded their documentation. So these are things that were predicted beforehand, with a level of accuracy that can hardly be attributed to mere speculation. Villanova himself has deliberately maintained a low profile, systematically avoiding public exposure factor that has contributed to preserving the integrity of the material. The few witnesses who have had direct access to the original manuscripts report unusual physical characteristics of the documents themselves, photoreactive properties that cannot be replicated with conventional technologies, and geometric patterns visible only under specific lighting conditions. This document does not claim to present absolute truth, nor does it seek to elicit uncritical acceptance I'm not telling you to believe. Its publication responds to the imperative of information availability set forth by the communication protocols described in the manuscripts themselves, according to which certain information must now be made accessible during specific time windows. This one coinciding with significant cosmic alignments. This one, I repeat to you, that this current stellar configuration, this 10-year window 2020 to 2030, only occurs once every 258 million years. With the galactic center, therefore, the reader is invited to maintain a balance between analytical skepticism and receptive openness, the same cognitive stance that, according to Villanova, represents the only mental configuration capable of accurately perceiving the patterns of communication documented here. Well, I have read, and now I know very well that you have your own thoughts and you should keep them. I am reading these documents to you. Then everyone does as they wish, and I was told to read them, so I read them. However, they have been prepared for a long time. I used to present them to other people. I will answer you later, gentlemen. Now I'm going to get ready and have dinner because it's 6 o'clock. I'm a bit tired. I also gave a lesson earlier. But I couldn't wait to share these things with you. This won't be the first. We'll talk about this. Then we'll talk about science. Then I'll read you the explanation that is given by the initiatic cycles. So the real one from the book. What's it called? By Gurdjieff, Beelzebub's Tales, to his grandson. So I think it's something that many people might enjoy, and many things are revealed. This is a critical decade. Critical. So if I do my job well, I mean, for what I'm able to say, it's not a matter of being afraid. It's simply about understanding what happened, what is happening. Even the pandemic was the same as the Second World War. We'll talk about it. It's described in the appendices, and you'll see that it's a kind of tuning of all minds toward one point, so that when what must happen does, everything is aligned toward that point. And we'll discuss it and see it together. These things have been in the background for a long time. It's time to talk about them. Well, I'll say goodbye for now. I don't know if it will be less of a book because these are documents. I send you a hug. If you liked it, give it a like. If you can, share it. If you don't want to, don't do it. Goodbye. See you next time. I'm a bit tired. Goodbye.